Okay, we are back for what should be the last installment of the climatic chapter of Peter and the Sword of Mercy. The train had been headed down the tracks, and then a very, very strange thing was about to occur. And again, we took a look at the cover, particularly behind all the action where Tinkerbell is kind of flying there to give us a clue as to that mysterious third thing that was going to happen. So where we are headed is we're going to wrap this chapter up, and then we're going to start to get some of those loose ends tied up as we kind of descend down that narrative elements plot outline that we've used so much this year. "We're flying," said Neville, sticking his head out of the cab of the first car. "What?" said Ted. He was with the others at the back of the car, trying to follow the action behind them. They had seen a blinding light fill the tunnel on both sides. Now suddenly it was gone. "The train," said Neville, scurrying back. "It's flying." "Good heavens," said Patrick, staring out the window. "He's right." The train, all three cars of it, was ascending gracefully into the dark London sky. Wendy ran to the passageway and peered into the next car. "Oh, no," she said. Peter, dazed by the fall, was struggling to his feet. He no longer had the sword, and he was no longer next to the chest. The skeleton was. Peter spun around and looked for an escape. The car door was still open. Peter could see the lights of London now, hundreds of feet below. If he could just get to the door, but in front of the door stood Umbra. Umbra started toward Peter, a walking corpse, eyes glowing, a charred hand reaching out. Peter took a step back. He heard a warning chime from Tinkerbell and turned around. The skeleton leaving the chest was coming toward him from that direction. He stepped on something. The sword. He reached down and picked it up. Umbra took a step closer. With all of his strength, Peter lunged forward and thrust the sword into Umbra's body. It went into his chest all the way to the handle. Peter let go. But Umbra kept coming. The sword impaling him had no effect. Peter whirled around. The skeleton was right behind him now, reaching out. The three of them had come together in the center of the car. Peter had nowhere to go. The skeleton's claw's hand brushed against Peter, and he screamed in agony. "It will be worse, much worse, before I let you die," said Umbra. The skeleton raised his hand again, and another horrible jolt of pain. Peter dropped to his knees, whimpering. "Leave him alone." It was Wendy. She had come through the passageway, and she was standing by the chest. She put her hand on the lid. "No," said Peter, "it will kill you." "The boy is right. If you open it, you will die." Wendy, ignoring him, her eyes were boring into Peter's. Like that. "Do you remember how we got off the ship?" Peter struggled and tried to remember. "I trusted you then, and I'm going to trust you now." Peter frowned, desperately trying to grasp what she meant. Then suddenly he understood. "No, you can't." But it was too late. With a fierce grunt, Wendy shoved the chest forward hard, directly striking at the trio in the center of the car. And as it slid across, the skeleton and Umbra both started toward her. But the moment they did, Wendy yanked up on the lid, and instantly the brilliant light again filled the car. Wendy, with a desperate lunge, pulled the lid all the way open as she dove sideways, hitting the floor, flying out of the car and into the night 1,000 feet above London. So what Wendy has essentially done is shoved the trunk and jumped out of the train, which would be like skydiving without a parachute right now. Pretty brave. Peter, a half a second behind her, but all the star stuff had left him nearly blind. He spun around desperately in the night sky, screaming, "Wendy, Wendy." He didn't hear anything but the rushing wind around him and then a hideous howl coming from somewhere above. And then he heard Tinkerbell far below. "You better hurry. I can't carry her." Following the sound, Peter dove straight down, flying faster than he had ever flown before. "Where?" he was screaming. "Tell me where." "Over here," came the chime response, and Peter veered towards the sound, and at Tinkerbell's direction, he veered again and again. His eyes were starting to adjust. He could see buildings rushing toward them. Where was she? "Over here," shouted Wendy, and then he had her in his arms, holding tight, fighting with all of his strength to slow their descent. He almost did as they came down clumsily, but not fatally, tumbling onto the roof of a butcher shop. "Are you all right?" said Peter. "I think so," said Wendy. "Next time, can you catch me a bit sooner?" "Huh. Next time, I might just stay on the island," said Peter. They looked up at the sky. The train was now about 2,000 feet up, climbing rapidly and glowing brightly like some strange comet. I better get up there, said Peter. If I don't close that lid to the chest, they're never coming down. I guess so, said Wendy. I'll be back, said Peter, launching himself into the sky. I hope so, said Wendy to the night. And that's the end of the chapter. So that is a scene from this chapter at the very, very end. Wendy opening the trunk lid just before she jumps out. I don't appear to see a sword stuck through Ambra. And there's also two guys behind them. I don't know if you can see their faces, but they're there too. So now we're going to tie up some of the loose ends, and this chapter is called The Promise. And we'll just kind of answer some of the questions that we might have as the book comes to a close. It took some time to get the train back down. Peter caught it quickly enough as it ascended gracefully over the vast city, now invisible beneath the cloud bank below. The brilliant light radiating from the open star-stuffed chest in the center of the car forced Peter to close his eyes as he drew near, although he could still tell where it was from the unearthly yet somehow pleasant music humming in the air. With Tinkerbell's help, he was able to find the chest and shut the lid. Instantly, the humming stopped and the car went dark, except for the dim moonlight coming through the windows. Peter blinked as his eyes adjusted, looking warily around for any sign of Ambra or the skeleton. But he was alone in the car. "Hello?" called Peter. "Hello?" answered a wary voice from the forward car. "Is that you, Peter?" It was Ted poking his head through the passageway. He was followed by Patrick and Neville, then McGill and Carl, all looking quite relieved to see him. Peter took a quick look into the rear car. Von Schotten's 4 guards were hiding in the back, showing no interest in causing any problems for Peter or getting anywhere near Carl. "Is Wendy okay?" asked Ted. "She's fine. When she opened the chest, she jumped out of the train, but I caught her." "Thanks to me," chimed Tink. "Thanks to Tinkerbell, and we managed to land safely." "I hope we can do the same," said Neville, casting an anxious glance out the window. "I'll see what I can do," said Peter, and he stepped out of the door and flew over the train. Inverting himself, he put his hands onto the roof and began to push downward. Slowly, the train responded, descending at a gentle angle. And in a few minutes, they reached the clouds, and the wind picked up a bit. They poked through the other side, and below them, only a few hundred feet, were the lights of London. "Does anybody know where we are?" shouted Peter. McGill, apparently unconcerned about the height, stood in the doorway looking down. "Ealing," he said. "Is there anybody right below us?" "No," said McGill. "You're all right." The following morning, a man walking his dog discovered a 3-car London Underground train sitting on the grass in Walpole Park, Ealing. The man reported this to the police, who assumed he was drunk and quite surprised to discover he wasn't. Over the coming weeks and months, many different explanations would be offered for the miraculous appearance of the train, including that it was some kind of prank by university students. But nobody really believed even university students were capable of such a feat. And so the train remained a mystery. By the time the police arrived, the train's occupants had been gone for hours. Von Schotten's men simply fled into the night. Patrick, Neville, and Ted took possession of the sword and the tip and the chest and managed after a lot of walking to get a cab which took them back to Scotland Landing Hotel. McGill and Carl went back on foot. Peter took off to look at Wendy, whom he found quickly with the unenthusiastic but effective help of Tinkerbell. He got her down from the roof of the butcher shop, and they walked to her parents' house. Peter offered to fly her, but she said she had been in the air quite enough for one night. The next day, everyone but Carl gathered at the Darling house. George and Molly were looking and feeling much better after eating, bathing, and sleeping. And when Mrs. Bumbrake arrived with John and Michael, there was a joyful family reunion with much hugging and even some crying. There was more crying when they paused a moment in memory of Leonard Astor. And then it was down to business as George, who had spent much of the morning telephoning various influential associates, summarized what he had learned. "Well, there's been quite a stir of activity at Buckingham Palace. The details are being kept secret, but apparently von Schotten has gone missing," looking at Wendy and Peter, "and stands accused of engaging in a plot against the crown. The king, who's like a different person, had ordered a full investigation, starting with a thorough interrogation of von Schotten's assistant, Simon Ravel. Ravel had been very cooperative in the hopes of saving his own skin, and Miss Scarlett Johns is also apparently cooperating willingly. The investigation has already produced some surprising results. Chief Superintendent Blake of Scotland Yard, apparently involved as well, has been relieved of his command and placed under arrest. Meanwhile, the men who went missing in the underground have all turned up, telling strange tales of being held captive in a tunnel. The tunnel has been located, and a mysterious vault as well, but nobody has a clue what any of it means. And the coronation, said Patrick? Oh, it'll proceed on schedule, said George. Seems things have gone rather well. Well, what about the cash, said Molly. What about it? What do we do with it, said Molly. What if they come after it again? I hadn't thought of that, said George. I suppose we'll need to hide it somewhere. I can hide it, growled McGill. In Wiltshire. There are caves there nobody knows of but me and Carl and the wolves. I can hide it there until you decide what to do with it. George looked around the room. All right. I'll leave tonight. What about the sword, said Patrick. What about it? Well, we have the Sword of Mercy. It was in the underground car with the chest. The tip was nearby. Apparently von Schotten managed to weld it to the sword, but it must have broken off when Peter used it to smash the lock on the chest. Peter remembered the sound of the tip clattering on the floor. I didn't hear anything about the crown jewels being missing. Maybe they don't know it's missing yet. In any event, said Molly, we have to get it back. How? We can't just walk into the Tower of London with a sword in. I'll return it, said Peter. I'm going to drop it off on my way back to the island. What? Said Wendy. Peter, said Molly, you don't need to go back so soon. Surely you can stay a few days. Peter shook his head. Von Schotten told me they were going after the island, too, to get the star stuff there. Molly frowned, remembering her brief encounter with von Schotten in the tunnel. He said the same thing to me. So I have to go back. We'll go with you, said Wendy. You helped us, now it's our turn to help you. How? You fly like a stone, said Tinkerbell. I appreciate it, Wendy, but Tinkerbell is right. You'd have to go by ship, and there isn't time. But, began Wendy. I'm sorry, said Peter. I have to go. Patrick, if you get me that sword, he rose, followed by the others except for Wendy, who sat with her face buried in her hands. Goodbye, everyone, said Peter, his eyes on Wendy. Peter, said George formally, I don't know how we can begin. Hush, George, said Molly, and George hushed. Molly put her hand on Peter's arm. Peter, we can never thank you enough. Just know that we love you and we will do anything for you. I know, said Peter, looking down, his face red. And promise us you'll come back and visit. Peter's eyes locked with hers, and they both remembered a moment long ago on the island when Molly, then a girl of Wendy's age, had asked him to make the same promise. He nodded. I promise, he said. Wendy began to sob, and Peter started toward her, then turned and went to the door. And that's the end of that chapter. So even though it feels like the story's over, we do have a few more loose ends to tie up back on Mollusk Island and a few more questions left to be answered. The interesting thing there that I don't want you to miss in the excitement of everything being resolved are, number one, the only mention we have of von Schotten / Ambra being gone is they did not find them in the train. Again, the authors are being very clever with their writing and leaving it open in case they decide to have either villain return. The second thing, which ties in with what we'll do once we finish this book, is they mention that McGill will hide the star stuff in the caves of Wiltshire. And that's exciting because that will get referenced in, of course, this book, which is the one that we will start after we finish our current book. The thing I like about this is it'll be very, very different than what we have read in the past with our other Peter books, while still tying in some really cool stuff. So I'm excited to start that, but remember that scene with McGill for when it comes time to start that. So we have roughly 30 pages to go, and then we finished our book, which is really, really exciting. So keep up with your read-alouds and tune in tomorrow for the next installment.